Hello, everyone. Hi, it's me, Miss Amber. I'm back for another English live lesson. This is for 11A. Today is Tuesday, so it's an English 11 day. And we're going to get started. Today's lesson should be the Voice of a Nation lesson from Unit 1. So this should be either the last or second to last lesson in Unit 1. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. We're just going to dive right in. Okay. So we're kind of moving on from the last lesson in this class, which was the American Revolution literature. So we're moving into the end of the transition from colonial literature. And we're now at a point where people are writing to convince their readers that the US should be independent from Britain. So there's a lot of persuasion happening here. As we talked about in the last lesson, there were some elements of persuasion, specifically because the governors, people meeting for the continental conferences were trying to convince their fellow statesmen that the states should form under specific ideas. People were making arguments about what the rules for the American nation should be like, and they were debating back and forth. So we're moving a little bit past this to the actual texts that were written up, which are like the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. So a lot of those texts had persuasive elements, because at this point, what we're trying to do is not just convince the people who are meeting about the rules of the nation, but we're convincing the people of the nation itself. There were still a lot of people who were split on whether or not America should be separated from Britain. So a lot of these documents had persuasive elements to them, specifically to try to convince the people who are reading them. Maybe you don't agree with what we're doing, but here are some reasons why it's important for us to do what we're doing. So here on this first slide, slide number 5, we get the elements of persuasion. So they're talking about one specific element of persuasion, which is the counter argument. Now, if you go to the English resource course, there is actually a section that is devoted to the different parts of a persuasive argument, and counter argument is one of them. You should be able to find that in the English 10 files. If you have the English resource course, you should be able to look in there and go over to one of the English 10 tabs. I'll go ahead and open it up now, actually. I want to keep showing you guys how useful this document is, because I know some of you aren't using it the way you should. But yes, okay. We have character foils on this one. So we have different arguments, persuasive and argumentative texts. And then let's see, 10B, we also have different types of essays. I think it's in 10A. Yeah, it's probably in 10A. Yep, about persuasive and argumentative text. So it tells you about the purpose, different types of appeals, and different parts of an argumentative text. So that's what you want to look at. And there are some other sections in here about arguments and what you should do to like build a good argument. Let's see if I can find one of the other ones. Euphemisms, organizational structures. No, this is personal essays. Oh, the essay structure. Now, I'm pretty sure that the essay structure has information about the different types of pieces to an argument. And there's also a link in the, let's see if I can find it, the resource course that will basically give you the different structure of an argument. It's in the additional help links. There you go. So I think it's in writing help. Gonna let it load really quickly. And again, if you don't have access to the English resource course that I'm looking at right here, so if you are a Step Up student, what you can do is message your mentor to get a link to the English concept list. And you can also get links to these documents. So this isn't on the English concept list, this is a separate doc, but what we can do is just actually copy the link up here and send it to you, and you'll have this. So there is a whole section here on argument papers. Rebuttal paragraphs is what you want to look at for this. All right, I'm gonna move on real quick. So for the counter argument, they explain that a counter argument is when you refute or address objections that the opposite side might have to your argument. So the idea is that by addressing what people are saying is not right about your argument, you come out looking a little more persuasive. If you just ignore what other people are saying and keep talking about what it is that you want to push, what that shows people is that you don't understand both sides of the argument. You don't get why people are objecting to certain things, or why people have issues with some of the things that you've said. However, if you acknowledge the ideas that other people have put out there and say, so I've heard this argument against what I'm saying, or I've seen in several places people doing this. Let me explain to you real quick why this doesn't work, or why my argument takes this into account. Because if you address the points that other people make against what you're saying, you look a little more like you know what you're talking about. It's better rounded. People feel like they can trust you a little more with what you're saying, because you're not just putting an idea into their head. You do actually have a well-rounded view of the issue, and you're addressing the concerns that people have. And this was a lot of what would happen in these sort of documents that we're going to be looking at. Down here, the counterpoints to the objections can be stated or implied. Writers often begin by anticipating and respectfully acknowledging any opposing ideas. You don't want to be spiteful when you do it. Oh, these people are dumb because they said XYZ. You don't want to do that. The reason why that is bad is because it comes off as you belittling the other side when they might actually have valid concerns. If you're just belittling people without being able to address the actual problems that they have with your argument or with the side that you're representing, what that shows other people is that you're not going to listen. You're not actually trying to find a solution. You just want to be right, or you want to punch down, or you want to insult other people. So it says they then point out contradictions, concerns, and other problems with these ideas. So you want to acknowledge what other people are saying respectfully in your paper, in your speech, or anything. And then what you want to do after that is make sure that you say, hey, I understand this is what people are saying. Here are the issues that I have with these things, and why I still support my argument despite the other side's concerns. So it says here, this refutation is meant to demonstrate that the writer's main argument is based on well-informed and objective reasoning that effectively considers important concerns. Oh, okay. So I give you an example of a counter argument here from a defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America. This is by John Adams, and he says, a Senate consisting of all that is most noble, wealthy, and able in the nation, with a right to counsel the crown at all times, is a check to the ministers and security against abuses, such as a body of nobles who never meet and have no such right can never accomplish. So he lists the benefits of having a Senate of elected members. He argues that it's good to actually have a Senate because they can accomplish the same thing instituted by the crown. So he says, it says here, he anticipates that his opponents could argue that a government instituted by the crown can accomplish the same goals as a proposed Senate. So he includes a counterclaim outlining how a body of nobles cannot achieve the Senate's goals due to the nobles' lack of unity and authority. So what he's trying to say is nobles who don't meet with each other, who don't actually convene to talk about issues, they can't come to a conclusion on solving problems if they never meet and never discuss things. And that it's important to have, he's implying it's important to have a lot of voices making the rules and not just one person. So you can have some nobles telling the king to do this, that, or the third, but they have to actually meet. They have to actually have ideas the king listens to. But if you have a Senate where everyone has equal say and people are just, advocating for what they think is best, then you end up with a group that can actually make decisions. Their job is specifically to meet to make these decisions. And you can see here, reading this, that this is like the foundation of the government that we have in the United States. So here on this slide, they just tell you basically what I said in the beginning, which is that counter arguments were especially common in literature from the age of reason. So a lot of people were trying to convince people who were on the fence, who weren't sure about American independence, that it was a good thing and that they needed to back it, that the people needed to back it. It says here, statesmen needed to persuade disapproving or hesitant colonists to support the American Revolution. The more support politicians gained from colleagues and other colonists, the greater the chances of the revolution would succeed. If people weren't willing to see the merit in America being an independent nation, you would have fewer people fighting in the army once different fights broke out. You would have some people working like underneath everything that's going on to like block certain things that are happening between America and Europe. So what they wanted was to actually persuade people, this is the right direction to go, even if you're not sure about it, here's why. So they tell you that the Declaration of Independence is one of the prominent persuasive texts from the Revolutionary era that demonstrates effective use of a counter argument. So the Declaration of Independence is full of a lot of logic about why America should be free and why being tethered and stuck to Britain isn't going to be great. So it's just one of the biggest and most famous examples from the age of reason that was written at the time. So the first reading selection here is the Declaration of Independence. So, I don't, go into the actual excerpts that are here, but we can still review the information around it. So they start off with giving you the background for Thomas Jefferson because he was the main author of the Declaration. So they tell you that he was very influential and they give you his background. He was born on a Virginia farm. They tell you where he graduated from and that he became a member of Virginia's legislature. They also tell you that he preferred to write his ideas out instead of being a public speaker. You don't really have very many speeches from Thomas Jefferson about anything. Almost all of his opinions are in writing, and he published them that way because he was talented and he didn't like speaking out loud. So he didn't have to depend on physically being there to persuade people. His writings were very convincing, and because the printing press was a thing at that time, you could have lots of copies of his writings in lots of people's hands. You could pass them out. People could share them with their friends. And that's basically how his rise to fame. You could also argue that because his writing was in print and not in person, he didn't have to rely on being charismatic while he was talking to people. He was able to make his arguments without having to rely on people liking him. They could actually just read his words and see if they agreed. And that makes people feel more convicted in agreeing with you. Because some people lead and are persuasive in person, but when you actually step back and look at what they're saying, you're not sure if you agree with them. He didn't have this problem. So they give you a little historical background about the Declaration of Independence. Now, the long story short is that the Continental Congress met in 1774 so that they could actually come together and say, hey, here are the rights that we have as colonial states. They sent something off to the British king basically saying, hey, here are our demands, and they were ignored. So they met again the next year in May of 1775. So the most prominent people who were there were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And they and a few other people were chosen to work together to draft the Bill of Rights. So they came together with their ideas, but Jefferson was trusted to put them all together in words. The Declaration was revised a lot of times. People don't know this. It wasn't just written in a first draft and it was great. They did actually get together, read it together, and decide, hey, we're going to cut this, we're going to add that. So they give you an example here. Changes included omitting, that means leaving out, a criticism of Britain for turning a blind eye to a corrupt parliament. So they decided to get rid of that because they felt like it was too accusatory. You don't want to come off like you're just throwing petty insults when you want someone to believe that you're right because of facts, not because of emotions. So it says they also omitted, unfortunately, a strong declaration against slavery. It says these revisions disappointed Jefferson, even though his stance against slavery was contradicted by his ownership of slaves. So that's just some of the background. The Declaration of Independence didn't come together just in one night. It wasn't just people, desperate to convince people. It was very planned and calculated. It went through several revisions, and people were able to add their ideas on why they thought certain things would be more or less effective to put in there. They wanted it to be a professional document because everyone would be reading it. And if it was accepted by the people, it would be the document that represents them as a nation. Now, before you get to the reading, they give you a little strategy here. So they basically want you to take account of charged words and look to see how many of them you can find in the document. So this is really simple. Charged words are just words that have strong emotional connections. Connotation that's exactly what that is. It's the word's emotional meaning. So people use those sort of words because they inspire emotion in others. So for the Declaration of Independence, they start you off with the first word of a table if you were to make something like that. And they show you that the charged word is loyalty. And then they give you the word's connotation. So not the denotation. The denotation is the dictionary definition. Denotation and dictionary both start with D. I always remember connotation because connotation and connection start with C. So they give you the word's connotation. What do people think of when they hear the word loyalty? Not necessarily what the definition is. Sometimes the definition is close to the emotional connection people have to the word, but it isn't always. And that's why they're suggesting doing a table. So they want you to do this so that you can make a note of which words inspire strong emotions and might have persuaded people who read this at the time. So then I get into an analysis. So the very first part of the analysis starts the preamble, which basically just says that it's necessary for the American colonies to break away from Britain and that they're going to provide reasons for that necessity. And then he supports his claims in the actual declaration. So just historically, we all know that the Declaration of Independence confirms that people should have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and that there should be an effectively run government. So basically, they're saying that if the government is unsuccessful in providing people with those rights, the people could abolish it or vote to have another type of government afterwards. The point was that this should be a nation for the people. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what the Declaration of Independence is about. The people deserve to be represented in a way that's fair. And if they think that this government isn't fair at some point, they could alter it, change it, or abolish it. And that's the basis of us being able to vote to change laws and policies about how things are done. So there is a counter argument in here. Sections where Jefferson anticipated anticipated objections. I'm sorry. So they give you a quote here. And then at the bottom here, it says, this passage acknowledges the opposing argument that a longstanding government system should not be changed for trivial or fleeting reasons. It proceeds to refute this opposing claim with a sound argument. Jefferson points out that the train of abuses and usurpations by the king and parliament are not at all trivial. He compares such offenses to absolute despotism, giving the colonists the right and duty to put an end to the repression. So the long story short of it is, he knows that people are going to say, if you give people the power to change how things are done, they're just going to change every single little thing all the time. And he says, well, you're saying that from a position of power. You make the rules and you declare that things are trivial when they actually aren't. People fighting for the throne, stealing the throne, being underhanded and using their powers of manipulation to affect laws that actually affect people and how they live. Those are not small things. Just because you don't want your court to be, like embarrassed, doesn't make those things small. That stuff is not small. So we should be able to vote to change how parliament and the crown works if it's doing a bad job. And it's not up to you to decide what's trivial. It should be up to the people. And then here they go over the next section right after the example they gave, where he goes over a long list of the king's crimes. Like, it's very long. And by creating that list, Thomas Jefferson focuses and amplifies, or he makes it, like more easy to see the offensive behavior of the king. His list helps to validate both why the British rule should be overthrown and that the colonists' call for independence is not fickle or short-lived. So he basically says, hey, remember when you did this, and when you did this, and when this happened, and your reaction was this? Do you remember all of these things that you did? Remember when the people disagreed with what you were doing and you said, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway? Here's a list of all those things. Instead of forgetting about it after, 30 years or something, maybe don't. Maybe you should, maybe we should look at this long list of crimes and demand something better, because this king has done a lot of messed up stuff, and we don't want to be ruled by somebody who's willing to disregard us to do just stuff that he wants to do, or things that are good for him, because the things that are good for him are not good for the people. People are suffering, they're poor, they're struggling. We had to come over here to basically run away from issues in Europe. So if it's that bad, maybe he shouldn't be in charge, So he's building a case for himself while also making the point that the people should be able to be in charge of themselves. It's very convincing. And then they talk about his use of charged words here. It says here, examples of charged words in these sections include tyranny, duty, and injury. These words call repeated attention to the corruption of the king and parliament. Like, you could describe it in a boring way. You could just say, well, they're ruling very badly. They are hurting everyday people, or there are people who are not doing well under this rule. You can say things like that, but that sounds boring. when you use words like tyranny, duty, and injury, it makes people take, like a second look. Oh, is it that bad? What does this word mean? Oh, wow, that's like a lot. They're really accusing him of doing that. Let's see if they explain why he's doing those things. And since there's literally a list of all the stuff the king has done, it's pretty convincing. It says here, by using deliberate word choice, Jefferson hopes to rally others around the fight for independence with no mention of the notion of freedom for the enslaved people or indentured servants in America. So they're giving you some historical points here because they had to omit the enslaved, like mentioning enslaved people, which Jefferson wanted to include. But since everyone thought the issue of slavery was too divisive, there were too many people who still wanted to support slavery. He didn't want to risk, or they didn't want to risk people not supporting the independence of America just so that they could keep slaves, which is unfortunate. But they are pointing out here that these powerful words, tyranny, duty, and injury, should have also applied to people who kept slaves at the time. But because they were more focused on having the nation be free of Britain's rule, they decided to scrap that. And they didn't make those connections. Okay, the second reading selection for this lesson is the US Constitution. So this is more of the same. This is the other document that has counter arguments and very age of reason, like typical writing for that time. So it basically starts off with, although the Declaration of Independence provided the arguments outlining the necessity to form a new government and nation, this document did not introduce any definite administrative or legal structures. So the Declaration of Independence was just a long doc explaining to the king and to other nations, basically to have it on paper. This is why we need to be independent. But it didn't actually outline any of the groups or rules that the nation would have. So it says, for a short time during and after the Revolutionary War, the United States adopted the Articles of Confederation to establish a government. However, under this form of government, the United States was a weak amalgamation of near independent states that began to dissolve. So basically, the issue was each of the states in the colonies had their own rules, completely independent. They didn't have to at all answer to each other. You could literally cross the state line and you would be beholden to lots and lots of different rules. Some things were legal in some states that were not legal in others. Some of the punishments for crimes in states were not the same as others. So for this reason, state delegates met to discuss ways to improve the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, they decided to create a new form of government, a federation under the Constitution of the United States. So then they dissolved the Articles of Confederation and adopted the US Constitution. And basically, they wrote things into the Constitution so that everyone would have to follow sort of the same rules. So each state could still create their own rules, but each representatives from each state still had to come together to decide on rules that they all made together, that they're all accountable for. And that's what the Constitution is. The Declaration of Independence tells Britain and the rest of the world officially, this is why we should be free and we're going to fight for it. The Constitution is, here's how we're going to still function while being a free nation. So on this slide 18, they address major concerns that people had about rules and how things go for the colonial era, as well as years under the Articles of Confederation. There were people who objected to certain rules, who were worried about how much representation that they would have based on the size of their state or the number of people who lived there. So the Constitution addressed all of those things and tried to make sure that the balance of power between the states was equal, so that no state ended up ruling the rest, or that no state's rules were more important than the others. So the solution that they were looking for was a federation, which is pretty much when a bunch of states come together with a central government to help centralize things to help to like have a central hub for different states to go to if they're having issues or need to pass bigger laws that affect more than just the state that they're in. Now, they divided the power into what we know today: legislative, that's the courts; executive, that would be the president; and I'm sorry, legislative, that's Congress, the lawmakers; executive is the president; and judicial is the courts. And the United States still abides by this Constitution. And people believe that the fact that we've been a successful nation after this proves that it works. The Constitution also has a preamble that explains why it was adopted and how it's related to the Declaration of Independence. So the two documents are linked. You almost never hear about one without the other, and this is why. Okay, so the last section of this lesson is just the focus on language. It's very simple. They give you some vocabulary, the part of speech and the definition, and some other parts of speech. Now, as per usual with these sort of things, I think that if you have never heard of these words, you should write them down and the definition. You don't always have to write down the pronunciation or the other parts of speech unless you really think you need it. But I would at least write down the word and the part of speech because you're building vocabulary here. A lot of these words show up in your reading selections and will show up in other things that you read in the future. So it's just good to get this foundation here now. The other slides are just questions about the vocabulary, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, this was a pretty short lesson, but the readings are just kind of long. There's a lot of big words, so take your time while you're reading through the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. If you need help with any of the explanations for persuasive arguments, you can look to the lesson, you can look to the English concept summaries. If you have any short questions, feel free to join the help desk, which runs from 11 to 3 p.m. You get the link for that in your weekly updates. You can also email the English department at english@atsedu.net. And you can also, lastly, book a session with a tutor if you're having a hard time understanding the reading selection. But other than that, that's it for me. Miss Amber, signing off, and good luck with your English class.